morning. My name is Juliano Cortinhas. I'm a professor at the International Relations Institute at the University of Brasilia and one of the coordinators of our study and research group on international security. I thank you all for attending the webinar. The idea today is to debate the relations between the COVID-19 pandemic and the environment, mostly some of the environmental crises we've been facing for a long time already, and will probably still be facing in the future. So we have three very important speakers today to discuss these issues. I would like to thank them for accepting the invitation. I would like also to thank some of our study group helpers, some of our supporters. These are students who work very hard to make this kind of thing happen. I would like especially to thank Julia Gouveia and Beatriz Bandeira for their support during the organization. I would like also to thank Domani Consultancy, which is a company created by our IR students to provide consultancies to Brazilian entrepreneurs who want to export. So they do a lot of advising for these entrepreneurs, and it's a company formed exclusively by our students. So it's a great pleasure to have them engaged with us. They provided us with this platform we're using today. So thanks again for the Money Consultancy. We have three very important speakers today, as I said. The first speaker will be Professor Larry Swatuk from the University of Waterloo. He's a professor at the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development, and is also a faculty member of the Water Institute. The Brasilia, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correct, Larry, but you can correct me later. The Brasilia School of International Affairs, and is cross-pointed to the School of Planning and the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. Dr. Swatuk's research focuses on the political economy of natural resources, with a particular focus on freshwater governance and management in the Global South. He teaches courses in global political economy, theories of international development, and water security. Swatuk is also associate editor of the open access journal Water Alternatives, and a founding member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. Our second speaker will be Ms. Kate Guy. She is a senior research fellow with the Center for Climate and Security and manager of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She is currently pursuing a PhD in international relations at the University of Oxford, where she researches the intersection of climate change, national security, and global governance. She most recently worked in American politics and policy as the Senior Policy Program Manager with the Truman National Security Project. And she was an assistant for the campaign manager of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential race. From 2010 to 2015, Kate worked on the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and environmental policy in various roles at the US State Department, the White House, the United Nations, and local and international NGOs. Finally, we're going to have Eduardo Viola, who holds a PhD in political science from the University of São Paulo and a postdoctorate in international political economy from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's a full professor of the International Relations Institute at the University of Brasilia since 1993. Although having retired since August 2018, he remains active as a senior professor in the institute. He is a CNPq researcher and the coordinator of the research group International System in the Anthropocene and the Global Climate Change, and lead faculty of the Earth System Governance Network. He was a visiting professor at the following universities: Notre Dame, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Unicamp, the University of Campinas, Colorado at Boulder, Amsterdam, Stanford, San Martin, and he was also a senior associated researcher at the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Lisboa. As you can see, these are very important participants, speakers that we have today. And we had a warm-up meeting yesterday. It was a great meeting, and I think that the debate will be very interesting, very profound. I thank you all for attending the meeting. Without further delay, I'll pass the floor to Larry. Larry, if you please could turn on your mic and your camera, that would be great. Thank you very much for coming. It's an honor to have you.
All right, thank you very much. Bom dia, meus amigos. Espero que todos estejam livres de vírus. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is virus-free. It gives me great pleasure to participate in this seminar today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a panoramic view of what might be the social, economic, and environmental context of today's crisis to help us think through some of the options that we have. I've painted a rather ugly picture, but I am a Canadian, so people say that Canadians are always optimistic. So we'll see what happens. You tell me. The coronavirus pandemic has revealed three facts.
Larry, I'm sorry, but if you could turn your camera on, I think it's better for us to watch you.
Yeah, but my camera is showing that it's on, Giuliano.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Well, go ahead.
So well, wait a minute. So when I turn it off, what happens? Do you see me now?
People are telling me that they can see you, so I think you're fine. It's probably my problem here, so they can see you. Okay, thanks.
Okay, all right. Sorry. You know what I look like, so I don't think it matters too much. So the coronavirus pandemic has, in my view, revealed three facts about the world. First, by dividing up the world in terms of sovereign states, each theoretically responsible for its own well-being, we guarantee competitiveness, secrecy, suspicion, and duplicity as the foundation of human interaction. Second, by fostering capitalism as the universal means for satisfying human wants and needs, we have embedded selfishness, greed, and exploitation of people and things in the interest of shareholder profit, not planet or people, as a fundamental organizing principle of exchange. And third, in encouraging over about 40 years, a type of capitalism that has turned the world into a casino with a few big winners and a great many losers. It's the big winners that make not only the rules for us, but our lived reality, largely by controlling the narrative and the way we are meant to see things. Now, in relation to the first 2 points, it took 2 world wars, a global pandemic, the Great Depression, and numerous national revolutions to recognize that such a system needed to be managed if the calamities of the first half of the 20th century were to be avoided. Yet, in relation to the third, we find ourselves moving in the opposite direction. So away from cooperation, away from collaborative management, toward the very practices that led us into World War more than 100 years ago. It should come as no surprise then, in my view, that China and the US blame each other for the spread of the virus. That the US president attempted to purchase patents, lab scientists related to vaccine development. And some people have called this vaccine nationalism. That in the absence of global demand, the entire edifice of globalized neoliberal capitalism has been rocked on its heels. But also it should not come as a surprise that the world has been able to take a deep breath, to recover fish stocks, to regrow forests, to increase biodiversity, to lower the GHG emissions that we've got and have cleaner air. So in some ways, the pandemic has allowed us, in a way, it's exposed for us the worst elements of our society, our global society, but has also provided a bit of fresh air and an opportunity to reset, right? Maybe to rethink the way we've been doing things and come at this from a different direction. In fact, Professor Viola yesterday said that this is kind of pandemic light, right? It's highly contagious, but not so virulent. So it's a little test for us. So if we get it right, maybe we can do things a little bit better. But the question is how. So where we have positive change, positive social change, we get kind of lessons from history. One is that elites and citizens, where they're both negatively impacted and relatively equally at risk, we have opportunities for positive social action. Second, and often more likely pathway, is that citizens organize to push elites in directions that they wouldn't normally travel down. So we have these kinds of lessons that sometimes when we face a collective crisis, rich and poor alike, and or citizens mobilize and organize and push in a desired direction, we can get positive change. However, at the present, it feels to me like elites are determined to get back to normal. And in my view, normal is very undesirable for many people. So what must be done? So in order to go forward, we have to go backwards. So let me talk a little bit about the pre-corona setting. The pre-corona world, as all of us know, was already deep in environmental, social, political, economic crisis, exhibiting a wide set of contradictory forces. So on one side, we have the emergence of new nationalisms, resurgent nationalisms in key states, Brazil, Turkey, India, UK, US. We have a retreat from a variety of mechanisms, especially by key players like the United States, that are in place to manage geopolitical and other sorts of global affairs. And we have nationalist growth strategies around fossil fuels development and resource exploitation that are exacerbating all of the negative trends that we've been seeing in the world. On the other side, of course, though, we have the SDGs, right? The Sustainable Development Goals, some kind of global goals working toward Agenda 2030, and we have 10 years to see what happens there. We have the Paris Agreement, and we have a wide array of civil society, private sector, government, quasi-government entities that support a whole wide range of kinds of global and regional governance arrangements, from forests to water to human rights and so on and so forth. So we have these contradictory entities in place. All right, so then Corona happens. Now, as I said earlier, the nature of the system guarantees a fragmented response, and we have seen that. And we'll go over some of that later. But there have been successes in the short term. States where there have been positive, where the virus has been limited or contained. We've had, state-directed social distancing, the shutdown of non-essential businesses, rapid acquisition and distribution of personal protective equipment, rollout of things like ventilators, retooling of national industries toward, away from, making ice hockey helmets to face masks for essential frontline workers. Now, of course, beside the positive evidence, there's numerous examples of the steps that shouldn't have been taken, partly due to the game nations play, right? States, as we see in relation to each other, feel like they must always project power and capability. So weakness is to be avoided at all costs. And I think this fear of showing that you are weak, which in my view, if you admit that you don't know, or if you admit that you don't have the answers, or if you admit that you are feeling a bit weak, is possibly a sign of strength. And we need to think about that as we move forward. But in places like China was unwilling to admit the viral outbreak had spun out of control. Trump doesn't want to talk about extensive testing because he says it makes America look weak. Putin's Russia refused to release data. And these kinds of dynamics of state-to-state power relations have actually not only divided us, but also have, in the divisions, opened up places for the virus to spread. So these three superpowers, to me, seem not so powerful. You can have all the weapons in the world, the military in the world, but what is the value of a nuclear weapon in face of a pandemic? There's been endless forms of misinformation and disinformation, blaming, pointing fingers at each other. Across the global south, some states have tried to mimic the richer countries. Many others have resisted lockdowns. where states have mimicked lockdown. They've enhanced surveillance. Do you want a government that has never served your interests, enhancing its surveillance of you? These are not necessarily good outcomes. It raises questions about leadership. When the world requires informed and stalwart and coordinated and collective leadership, what we find are strong men posturing while putting one wrong foot in front of the other. Modi forcing his forced exile of migrant workers, Bolsonaro's claim that coronavirus is a little flu, Brazilians do not catch anything, Trump's recommendation to drink bleach. These are not the basis upon which we are going to collectively meet a global challenge. In fact, the best performers, evidence shows, are states that are headed by women and or having strong social welfare systems and are also more communally inclined. And so those are things that we need to take. Maybe our first takeaway lesson is, if you want strong performance in collective action, vote for a woman. It's a distressing picture, but there's a few positive takeaways. So my positive takeaways, if I'm looking at post-corona, okay, best practice in relation to the pandemic involves things like focused, coordinated action based on the best available relevant information, placing the collective social good above narrow self-interest, strong and unwavering support for well-funded science, a clear unified message regarding appropriate action, a commitment to deep engagement with the public and private sectors to ensure appropriate knowledge mobilization, demonstrated state capacity for delivery on promises and meeting of targets, and this extends across financial, technical, human, and natural resource spheres. Clear penalties to be applied for non-adopters in a non-partisan way. A structured roadmap for progress with transparency and benchmarking, monitoring, assessment, and of course, action, a kind of a cyclical, reflective approach to things involving action, assessment, adjustment, more action, and repeat, suggesting a commitment to the long term while acting in the short and medium terms. And I think it's also clear that we know what to avoid. We need to avoid mixed messages delivered in a narrow self-interest. We need to avoid a lack of cooperation and collaboration. We need to avoid the politicization of action, like putting your name on checks going out to people, as President Trump has done. Okay, moving to the last part of my presentation then, in a post-corona world, can it be a world that is better for all? Can we carry the positive in the post-corona? Can we carry forward the positive in the post-corona environment, if we're ever going to get to a post-corona environment? As I said earlier, the pandemic should give us pause to consider what we want in the long term, not just to survive in the short term. As I said earlier, it's also a kind of pandemic light. It's pushing us to see how we respond collectively. But that raises this notion of the tools with which we are equipped. We are currently equipped. And you know that saying that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And at the moment, it looks to me like many world leaders, not all, but many, and many influential ones, have a very old notebook in one hand and a very big hammer in the other, involving getting back to normal. But that normal world is a world of radical inequality, social injustice, environmental collapse. Do we want that? Just because it's the devil we know, we're comfortable in our chains? I don't know. There are many calling for dramatic change. Everybody who is signed on to this webinar, I think, you are eager for dramatic change. We have seen that people can be mobilized in mutual support and concern for fellow citizens. Every day, people are out on the balconies singing to each other or banging pots in the street in support of frontline workers. We're trying to make the best of things. And if we all bake bread together, can we all then move forward together? I wonder. It's clear that the state can be made to operate in the greater good. It's not natural to the state. In theory, we talk about it that way, but it's not natural, but it can be pushed in that direction. We have seen that things that they've said they can't do are actually must be done. Instituting free basic income, increased regulations, possibly higher taxes coming for the rich. These are not only possible, but beneficial to people and planet alike. We've also heard shovel-ready projects must be green growth oriented, right? So post 2008, we had this, we had to get everybody back to work, and we just, ramped up the carbon intensive activities. So there are lots of people who are trying to push for green growth oriented responses. We've seen that companies can be retooled toward a circular economy. So these things can be done. Now, of course, I'm not naive, right? There's too little evidence that the dramatic state interventions are going to be anything but short-term. The virus is going to cycle around the world, creating winners and losers. And in a global casino economy, the stock markets will be hunting for pluses and minuses and creating havoc as we go along. Let's not be naive about the barriers. We are fragmented. We are competitive. Neoliberal capitalism is proving a very difficult approach to providing goods and services to people, difficult to displace. The system privileges the powerful, and coronavirus, like climate change, creates winners and losers. It's an uneven kind of thing. Yesterday, in another webinar, the former foreign minister of Sweden mentioned that coronavirus, because we can see it, it's this slimy ball with kind of sucker things on it. It's an enemy that we can see. And so we should be able to mobilize around it. It gives us a visual thing, and we know, do you have it? Do you not have it? There are metrics. Climate change, for example, and of course, Kate will have more to say about this, but climate change is a different thing. It's hard to see this ever morphing kinds of thing. So lastly, where do we go? Well, global governance, as I said earlier, emerged out of the 20th century's 30 Years' War, 1914 to 1945, which was punctuated itself by a pandemic flu. The architecture rested on the notion of active states, each devoted to a national social project in line with a global and social project designed around openness, cooperation, and the rule of law. It was a new world arisen out of the ashes of 100 years of complete chaos. And I think we abandon these instruments of cooperation at our peril. They say if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're going to repeat them, right? So those of us who are interested in transformation, we have to seize this moment. I think a webinar like this is emblematic of the desire to seize this moment, to organize, right? We have to organize on behalf of the voiceless, the deliberately marginalized, the poor, the homeless, and ourselves, right? I feel that I am one of the, the people perfectly positioned because I am in some ways occupying space below the 1% and above the rest. So I have the space, the intellectual space, and the economic wealth to be able to critically reflect on what is possible, to share this and to reach out. And I think we all want to do that. We all should do that. We have to enlist the media. This is media, but we have to get into the broader media, largely defined, to have a conversation about, in light of Corona, what should stay and what should go. Should we keep basic social income, guaranteed social income? What should go? What should stay? We need a succinct assessment of state actions taken in response to the pandemic. What worked? What didn't work? We have to bring decision makers in. We can't always be throwing bricks at our parliament, our state buildings. We have to somehow highlight positives, be strategic, get together with them, because this moment will not last, right? It feels like the moment to me is slipping away right now. The websites, the airwaves are cluttered with talk of returning to normal. Tonight in Canada, in fact, the National Broadcasting Network is going to have a webinar on how we get back to normal, and I'm hoping that there will be some critical conversation inside of that, but I'm worried that it will be dominated by the language of markets and so on and so forth. The pandemic has opened spaces. This is my last point. The pandemic has opened spaces, no doubt temporarily, for dialogue. So we must occupy those spaces now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry, for a very interesting presentation. I'll pass the floor to Kate now. Kate, it's an honor to have you. Kate is a senior fellow from the Center for Climate and Security. So I think she'll have a lot of interesting points to add to Larry's presentation. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Larry.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Larry, Juliano, everyone for joining today. My Portuguese is much poorer than Larry's, but I'll say bom dia to all of you, especially to, it looks like my little niece, Scarlett, has tuned in. She's a first grader back in Minnesota, where I grew up. So hopefully this is a great lesson for her as well as for all of you. And hopefully not too depressing, but no promises there. So the question I'm going to pose today and give us some answers to reflect on is, what does this coronavirus pandemic mean for climate change? And we can answer this in many ways, but the one that has continually come to my mind, I suppose, since the moment the shock began, is that this is, I mean, Larry called it a pandemic light, but it's also climate change light. It's also a shock that's hitting the entire system, and we as researchers can learn a lot from what that looks like and what that means to learn for what the future of climate change looks like, this climate changed era that we're moving into. So first, just a quick story. I was very fortunate enough this February to be at the Munich Security Conference, the kind of preeminent world of all the security actors coming together to discuss pressing security threats and risks, and was there to actually present a report that I had written with the International Military Council on Climate and Security, an annual climate and security report. And this was a pretty new thing. It's new for climate change to be in that space of national security leaders. But while we were there, and this was end of February, the Secretary General Tedros of the WHO was there to kind of talk about this coronavirus threat that was brewing up. And I just think it was so interesting to kind of give you that image of the WHO Secretary General briefing the world security leaders on the coronavirus, and the room was maybe not even half full. And that was, as we know, just a few weeks before this blew up to such a level that every single leader, security or not, is finding it threatening their entire way of life in each country in the world. And what does that mean that even a few weeks before the shock, really rose to that international level, it was being totally undervalued by the security leaders, by the political leaders in that space, and not seen to be as rising to their level of importance that they would come and join that briefing. And I think that is emblematic of the climate change threat as well, that it's a threat that for a long time our leaders have not taken seriously, security or otherwise, and have not risen to the moment in order to prepare for the threats to come. But hopefully, as Larry and others say, this will be that kind of stress test of the system, wake everybody up and see that we need to do something different and chart a different course to deal with the effects that are coming because of climate change. So how might we learn from this global pandemic moment? What are the lessons to draw? So I think there are three big lessons about how globally we have responded to or failed to respond to the shock that are very important when you think about the future coming of climate change. So the first is the extreme lack of coordination that we've seen among countries, among leaders all around the world. It is, I think, actually incredible, and potentially we haven't seen a moment like this before. I think a large element of that is the lack of US leadership, but you really have every country going its own way. The University of Oxford, where I study and research, has put together a great tool looking at comparing each policy option and policy way forward of each country in the world. And there are no two that have chosen the same path. And within that, you have mixed messages of what's good and what's bad, what works, what doesn't. There are also kind of brewing difficulties at borders of countries as some open up and some don't. And this lack of coordination has just made a very messy way through this crisis on the public health side as well as on the economic side. And if we kind of extend this lack of coordination forward to the climate change era, that is going to be very problematic. Natural disasters, climate shocks know no borders. They do not recognize, our systems as we've created them, and will cause things that naturally necessitate response, either intergovernmental or fully global response. That's migration across regions. Even the economic and technological efforts to curb the warming problem will take massive coordination, let alone if they become geoengineering technology deployment and things like that. All of these will need to be coordinated very closely among countries so that we can minimize harm and also maximize our response to the problem. And if this lack of coordination that we're seeing now bears any telling on the future, I think that's quite worrying for our ability to act collectively in the face of climate change. The second big lesson, I think, to be drawn is the unfortunate moment we've seen with authoritarian and backsliding governments around the world using this crisis to propel and solidify their own power undemocratically. So this is the Philippines, this is the Russian regime, this is Orban in Hungary, this is to an extent even leaders potentially like Donald Trump and democracies, where you are seeing a need in some circumstances to temporarily put aside the liberal values that we hold so close, the human rights that we hold so close, in the voice of limiting the pandemic, of course. So saying everybody must stay inside, that's restricting our values and movement. But the real question is, will those rules be relaxed at the other end of this moment? Are there sunset clauses in those new laws that leaders are passing? And for many of them that I just named, that is not the case. And if anything, these leaders are using these moments to crack down on their opposition, to limit the power of the press, to have an insight and commentary into their leadership, and in the case of Hungary, even extend their personal mandate into indefinite rule. And that is coming in this shock moment. And that, again, this is very concerning for the climate era, where there will be many, many such emergencies hitting all across the world, sort of all at the same time. And what you will likely see in those same circumstances is leaders who are undemocratic taking advantage of those shock moments to grab power, to restrict civil liberties of their populations, and not to mention the sort of second order effects of these crises. So that migration that I talked about, the ethno-nationalist responses to migration we're seeing all across the world, as well as the populist responses to economic hardship across the world. These are all ingredients that authoritarian leaders use to perpetuate crises and then take advantage of them to bolster their own personalities, to make that strong man leadership model more attractive, and also to, as I have said, consolidate their power. And so this is certainly a moment to learn from how our leaders are taking advantage of that, and to understand that these crises are going to be very frequent in the future. And so you're only creating more environments for bad actors to take advantage of. The third big lesson I would say we need to learn from this moment is just the devastating power of overlapping and cascading shocks. So I think this public health crisis at a global scale is bad enough, not to mention the overlapping issues of economic shutdown, of food insecurity, of supply chain disruption, of the massive economic and unemployment toll that the response to the crisis has engendered. And then the likely future global financial implications of massively exploding sovereign debt and bailouts and bankruptcies at the national level that are yet to come. And again, I think this is an important lesson for the new normal that is the climate era, because one shock will not kind of come along singularly anymore for a country or the world to deal with. They are going to be overlapping and interacting with each other in profound ways. So governments will be forced to deal with these types of shocks in potentially a whack-a-mole style, as we've seen so far, with disaster responses kind of mounting as the year goes on and as multiple years goes on. So an example of this is in the US, when you had a severe drought in one region of the Midwest with severe flooding just a few states south as intense rains hit that area, and you have to kind of respond and rebuild both areas. or extremely historic wildfires hitting the west of the country, while extremely historic hurricanes and storms are hitting the east. And luckily, I think a rich country like the US or rich countries like in Europe can potentially for a while handle that and have the budgets needed to rebuild. But poorer countries or state or local governments without that cushion are seeing their own resilience, which is really just a measure of how quickly you're able to bounce back from a shock. That resilience is dwindling with each event that drains the resources and political will of a society to respond. And that's when that fragility rises, when institutional collapse entirely becomes more likely. And when you see things like violence and conflict and disagreement spike because of inequality. So that's a pretty sad picture of this current moment, but is there hope to be found in this moment? Larry gave us some. So my research, and this is again really building on where Larry left us, is looking at these, they're called critical junctures in the historical institutionalist literature. And a critical juncture is one of those defining moments in which, because of some shock or some crises, political actors both have a broader scope of actions ahead of them than might have otherwise been possible. But those actions that they take are of heightened importance and can actually define and reshape the world going forward. So absolutely, at the end of the Second World War, that was one of those critical juncture moments where countries were able to do things they weren't otherwise able to do, consolidate power, build institutions, but also set in place infrastructure and architecture at the global level and at the national level as well that has defined the era ever since. And could this coronavirus moment, or perhaps another shock or two to come, be a critical juncture at the international level as well? I think we're seeing early signs of that. So already on the climate side, the pandemic is really scrambling international negotiation. And the huge kind of negotiating conferences on biodiversity and on climate change that were meant to happen later this fall in China and in Scotland, both of those have been pushed back to next year. And we're kind of unsure what that stall means. Now, in a good kind of positive framing, that could be good, right? It could be good that those have been pushed off into this potential beginning of a new era that Larry painted for us, potentially into a new US governmental administration or multiple different governments and leaders around the world who have really been tested and risen from the ashes of this moment, and quoting Larry, and potentially a new political will across Europe and across the world to make the recovery from this moment green and climate proofed. The ability to invest vast sums of money into spurring economic activity. No one would have imagined that as possible at the beginning of this year, and now that's inevitable. So is that a place to kind of raise that international ambition to tackle not just the economic crisis, but the larger climate biodiversity crises that are on our doorstep? And in that recovery moment, potentially, there is also new space to build institutions that actually have a chance to be able to handle these type of shocks going forward. So this is something I see very front of mind every time I'm kind of within the UN system. We have institutions and infrastructure that were built for us at the end of the Second World War to deal with the mid-20th century security crises and shocks from that time. We do not have institutions currently that can withstand even, quote, pandemic light, let alone climate change and biodiversity loss and massive environmental risks and shocks that we're dealing with. So what would those institutions look like? This is hopefully a chance for us to not only solve and mitigate the climate crisis, but actually rethink a lot of our interactions at the global level and rethink what is important. So just a few things of what that could look like. And I'm really hoping are already being kind of fed into the international discussion about institution building and response. So that's reinvigorated international cooperation, of course, but what does that cooperation need to be around? It needs to be around building resilience to shocks at the infrastructural level, but also the institutional level. It's yes, investing in green and sustainable infrastructure, but it's also coordinating internationally foresight and monitoring capabilities. So we can see these things coming, and we have early warning systems when there might be a flare up, either within the weather or within social systems. And it also means a new capability to pool resources so that we can respond in one area of the globe so that it doesn't spiral up to the international level. I also truly believe that this needs to be a moment to reinforce our liberal values and human rights globally, and to expand those to include not just the human rights that were written in the 1940s, but to include things like healthcare access, which we've become incredibly reliant on in this moment, but also safer livelihood, sustainability and environmental health. These are things that were written in the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, but are all the more important to actually build international infrastructure and architecture around, not just have a nice wish list of how we wish the world would look. We're seeing now that it's actually very important that those overlapping and interconnected goals are the program of international cooperation going forward. And then finally, I think on the geopolitical stage, this new era could look like, I mean, I unfortunately, just especially seeing where the great powers are moving and going on a political scale, I don't think it's ever really going to be a moment at the present time to leave behind geopolitical competition. But what I hope we can see is that great powers who are increasingly at each other's necks, maybe economically, could find spaces and issues like climate change or like biodiversity around which they can cooperate. Right, so this is, even in the Cold War, you had Russia and the United States, or sorry, the Soviet Union and the United States cooperating on issues like nuclear non-proliferation, things that they had common interests around, and could slowly sort of over years be built up into spaces of cooperation. And I sincerely hope that climate change, just given the massive implications that has for the entire world, let alone every great power and their kind of regional or global power, will understand that they need to act collectively and not competitively on things like climate or on the back of climate or global health shocks. And then I think that can be engendered and spurred truly by population-wide shifting of behaviors and values that we've seen at a pretty massive scale these last few weeks. And that moment to really speak to people and change their values, I think you only have those moments sort of once in a lifetime. I think on climate change, we were already starting to get there with Greta and the school strikes and the massive outpouring of young people around these issues. We were already starting to shift values. And it's my hope that this moment of international crisis has really shifted those even further and changed that Overton window of what's possible in a cooperative sense, what's possible in a global sense, as well as what's possible on an individual sense. And that hopefully that means that shifting of personal values and interests is also shifting the politics on this and shifting what populations demand of their leaders and what they will hold them accountable for in this moment and going forward for climate change. So I'll stop there, but really looking forward to discussion around this and any other issues. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kate. It was very interesting to set an agenda for what we should do in the future and how we should relate to the lessons we are hopefully learning. I say hopefully because we're not sure yet if we have learned something and how much we have learned. I'll pass the floor now to Professor Eduardo Viola, who I thank a lot for accepting the invitation. It's going to be an honor to listen to you, Professor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Giuliano, for organizing this very interesting webinar. I have 9 points to make. Okay, this is not in a logical order, but some of them has been touched partially by some of by Kate and Larry, others no. The first point is about the profile of this pandemic. This is a non-severe pandemic, okay? If you look at the predictions of epidemiologists since the 1990s, there was a significant probability of having in the near or middle term future a very severe pandemic. Very severe pandemic is one that is very contagious and has a high fatality rate. Okay, this COVID-19 is very contagious, but has not a high fatality rate. Okay, particularly you need to consider another denominator that is not the denominator of confirmed cases by tests in relation in the fatality rate. That is that depending on countries, but in most countries, estimations are that the people infected varies between 10 and 15%. Okay, so if you look there, the fatality rate in most countries is below 1% and significant below 1%. So I would like to repeat what was the assessment of Bill Gates, that is one of the most important today systemic expert in global health and pandemics. He says this is a great opportunity for humanity because it's a wake-up call, but it's not a severe pandemic. So the preparation of humanity for a severe pandemic was nothing, more or less. And so this pandemic create the conditions for changing the whole health policy in the countries and in global cooperation in terms of preparing for a more severe pandemic and other pandemics that are very likely, increasingly likely, because of the interconnectedness of the world and because of biodiversity erosion and climate change are promoting an increase on new emergent virus. Okay, so this is the first point. The second point is about the responses, national responses to the pandemic that are very heterogeneous. My hypothesis is that the heterogeneity, the success or failure of countries in relation to the pandemic is related to the quality of the governance system. In the democratic world, this has to do with the quality of democracy. In autocracies, it's different because you can have an effective government, but that is an autocracy. Though it's easier to have an effective government in general, every issue in a democracy than in an autocracy, because of the lack of feedback in autocracies about mistakes, the possibility of correcting mistakes. Okay, but so and the other thing that is important is that they related to some cultural issues. For example, the better response of Asia compared with the West is related to some cultural characteristic of the Asian culture that is more collective. There is more equilibrium between the individual and the collective, and in the West is much more maximizing individualism. Okay, so if you look, you can have democracies that the best approaches to the pandemic, best responses has been in democracies like Taiwan and South Korea. Okay, but also you have a very good response in Vietnam that is an autocracy, and in China it's mixed because it was very bad at the beginning, but it is good afterwards. Okay. The third point is that I think more important than the pandemic is the outcome of the American elections in November. Okay, for the dynamic of the international system. Okay, why? because the what seems more likely right now, a victory of the Democratic Party in the presidency and in the House, and even could be in the Senate, will change a lot the trajectory of United States in terms of having a much more friendly approach to global governance, in terms of rebuilding a kind of alliance of democracies, and in terms of being more less rudimentary in the confrontation with autocracies. The confrontation between autocracies and democracies is something that is here for a long, long time. I mean, it didn't disappear after the Cold War. That there was a lot of possibilities. The convergence of China with the West that happens since the late 70s to the middle 2010s is right now in reverse. This is clear. So this confrontation will be present, but could be more rational, because the Western, the liberal democracies, and particularly the American approach could be much more emphasizing areas of cooperation, okay, like clearly pandemic, climate change, biodiversity erosion. Okay, so trying to have a more rational geopolitical conflict. The fourth point is about a potential change that is already happening in neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism was settled during the 80s after the election of Reagan and Thatcher, okay, and expanded all over the world very fast until the 2008 economic crisis, but continues until 2020. But now the impact of the pandemic is severe enough in terms of the governance system and economic crisis, possibility of economic depression in many countries of the world, that it is clear how most states, high income and middle income states, are increasing dramatically their public expenditure, okay? And so it's a significant advance of the state over markets, okay? That I think that this is very, very strong right now. This will diminish, but in my view, it's likely that it will continue in the future. And we will have a relation, a state society, state markets different from the last 40 years, okay? I'm not saying that we are coming back to the capitalism before the 1980, but this will be a major turning point, okay? We have a turning point in global capitalism in the 1930s, a second turning point in the early 80s, and now probably we are starting a new turning point. The fifth point I want to make is about the impact of the pandemic on climate change. Okay, this is multidimensional. One thing that is very difficult to know right now is how far the significant proportion of global mass public and elites will connect the vulnerability of humanity in relation to the pandemic with the vulnerability of humanity in relation to climate change. Climate change is a much more strong threat to humanity that this pandemic, not in relation to other potential pandemics that are much severe. Could be worse than climate change, but certainly this pandemic is a threat that is lower than the climate change. Okay, so it's difficult to know. This is something that we need to be significant amount of time within the pandemic dynamic and the transformations of mindsets. We don't have surveys significant right now across the world, across countries, all these kind of things. This will be very, very important area of research. And the same in relation to the erosion of biodiversity, because there is a lot of connection between the erosion of biodiversity, deforestation, and the transition of virus from animals to humans. Okay, and that this happened not just now with coronavirus, happened many times with virus that are transmitted to humans from animals, particularly from Asia. Okay, and China is a major responsible in this point. To me, it was amazing how China, that is a middle-income country and a great power, didn't still, after the experience of H1N1, SARS, and so on, how they didn't prohibited this dynamic in which you have together very close humans, wild animals, and domestic animals. That is very common in Asia. So this is a major question, open question, that could have significant consequences for the future of humanity, depending on the impact. The impact could be very low, so people continues to not consider as a priority climate change. I mean, rhetorically you can consider it. This is clear today that rhetorically in the elites, global elites, this is very, the Davos conference in January was a very important example about how the global elites are concerned about. But the question is, if there is a transformation in the mass public that pressure the global elites in the direction of really considering a priority, a collective action in relation to climate change, a national action in relation to climate change. Right? So there is another question. In the short term, in the very short term, the pandemic prevails in a way that we can likely the attention to climate change and environmental issues will be lower than before the pandemic. So we have the short-term negative outcome, the pandemic over environmental issues, climate change, and biodiversity loss. Middle and long-term uncertainty, opportunities of change or not. Okay. The sixth point is related to, let me see, here. How the sixth is very connected with the fifth, okay? So how the pandemic, because of promoting a reflection in societies, in mass public and elites, about the relations between nature and humanity. So let's say the pandemic produced a shift in the mindset of humanity in relation to the vulnerability to virus. Okay. Not in the core of the scientific community, epidemiology, because they know this since at least half a century, okay. But in the mass public and in the global elites and even in a wider in scientific community, that this concern is not a focus. I mean, this is a focus among epidemiologists and virologists. Okay, so this is something that is an open question. We need research about what is happening with this. So the 7th point is my hypothesis is that during the pandemic we are already having a increasing the prestige of science in the society. So what happened? We have this erosion of the prestige of science in society during the 2010s. That is directly connected to the emergence and development and strengthening of right-wing populism. Okay, and the more important examples of skepticism about climate change and about vaccines. Okay, but there are other examples also. So what happened is that the pandemic is showing that the importance of science and the scientific expertise to the decision makers for dealing consistently with the pandemic. So this doesn't imply that all the people that are, right-wing populism in liberal democracies are going to change very fast. But for sure, there is an increased prestige of science, in my view. We don't have the measure of this right now. Okay, so we have just proxy measure. The 8th point is about another question that is, I think, very, very relevant, is not very present in the debate right now. That is how there will be more awareness, more reflection, and maybe changing mindset in societies in relation to the importance of the immune system in the populations. Okay, we know that for any epidemic, or even the one major, the most important variable is who is more vulnerable. Is people, it depends on the strength of the immune system of the person. Okay, so people with a strong immune system are much less vulnerable. People with weak small immune system are very vulnerable. The way that this picture or depict, generally speaking, is age, but age is indirect, because most people older than 50, 60 years had a weakening strong immune system. But this is not necessarily correlation. There are a significant amount of people, healthy people, that are older than 60 and have a very strong immune system. Okay, and vice versa. In countries like United States and Brazil, the proportion of people with very weak immune system is very, very high among young people. So the question is more or less the same. The strength of the immune system is related to lifestyle, okay? And the lifestyle include the food, exercises, sleeping, and stress management. So people we are high in these 4 dimensions generally don't have chronic metabolic illness, like hyper blood pressure, diabetes, breathing problems, different kinds of a lot of the external manifestation of this is generally obesity and significant overweight. Okay, for example, in the United States, 40% of the population is obese, and more than 30% of the population are with significant increase in weight. Okay, so the question is, this is a completely open-ended question. Is possible that this pandemic and this perception of vulnerability will increase the amount of the proportion of people and elites that are aware about the importance of strengthening the immune system of the society and each individual, each one. Okay, this is open-ended question. And the last point is about Brazil. That is very fast to see. I mean, the Bolsonaro administration is very extreme in the spectrum of the world, both in environmental and climate policy and in response to the pandemic. Okay, and so there is a convergence, negative convergence in those dimensions. The erosion of environmental policy in Brazil didn't start with Bolsonaro. We have the peak of increasing of consistency in environmental policy around 2012. Okay, starting in 2013, there started gradual erosion. Okay, and this was strongly accelerated by the Bolsonaro administration. And in relation to the response to the pandemic, we know that the response of the Bolsonaro administration has been mixed, because Bolsonaro and some part of the cabinet have a very terrible, disastrous response. But there is another part of the cabinet that is more rational, let's say. Okay, so from the other side, we have the subnational governments, states and municipal governments, that most of them are confronting the stream of Bolsonaro presidents and part of the cabinet. Okay, so so right now in Brazil, for understanding the dynamic of the Brazilian society, you don't understand if you just look at Bolsonaro. That is very common all over the world. People look, oh, Bolsonaro spoke that, or this is the thing. I mean, these areas of the administration, ministers are saying things that are completely delirious, let's say. But on the other side, you need to consider that there is all the subnational governments and even the more rational part of the cabinet that don't share the Bolsonaro approach. Okay, and so the dynamic is mixed. It confuses a lot of people. This is the major problem. But it's important. I want to call the attention to this. For understanding the Brazilian response to the pandemic, you need to focus both in the federal government and in the state and municipal governments, and consider that despite Brazil is a very dysfunctional federation, okay, the opposite of Germany, let's say, but it's more dysfunctional in many dimensions than the American. But at the same time, at this conjuncture, the pandemic, the federal system is, let's say, is containing the irrationality of the presidents. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Viola. It was very interesting to listen to your 9 points, and they show very, very well the complexity of the moment and how difficult it will be for us to try to solve these issues, especially in the long term. We already have some questions that were posed by one of the participants. I would like to ask a question too. I think mine is a little shorter, so I will start with that. It's an open question for the three of you. Among your talks, I see that we have a very difficult system that was built under different circumstances, under a different background, based on the action of states, and we need now a more globalized response for most of the problems we've been discussed, for all of the problems we've been discussing, such as climate change, resources, the pandemic. But do you think that this transformation will come from the states themselves? Will they get out of the I would say the pragmatism that they are in right now? And if not, how can people work to change things? I know that today we have all the communication systems, all the communication technologies, but somehow it seems to me that they're still dominated by finance. Whoever runs the internet deals the cards, I think. So how can people be heard? That's because, well, especially in the biggest democracies, we've been having this movement to the right, to the more conservative view. So this strikes me a lot. So that was my question. We have questions from Rafael, one for Larry. He says, Larry makes an attempt to focus on the realm of possible concrete action, also highlighting the need to push the state to act towards the common good. But going back to the beginning of his presentation, when he provided some characteristics of capitalism as promoting selfishness, for example, my question is, if we are successful in pushing the state towards the common good, is it possible to maintain it under capitalism? Can we have long-term and successful governance for the common good within capitalism and despite its defining social characteristics? And then a question for Kate. Kate spoke of the lack of coordination and the lack of US leadership, making a link with some of Larry's points. Is it possible to say that capitalism makes the cooperation more difficult? Thinking that policies in apparently non-economic areas, climate, health, might have economic aspects and implications. The reason for my question is because what we have seen is more serious than a lack of coordination, but actually a move towards competition. Competition for health sources. We have seen cases in which shipments of EPIs and respiratory machines to developing countries have been canceled en route. And fears of a change in the balance of power in the geopolitical level. Trump accusing the WHO of supporting China politically. Both worked against the limited possibilities of coordination. And then he adds, in other words, might the WHO not be the better option for centering coordination than the USA? Okay, so I'll pass the floor to you.
Sure, I'm happy to start off and then we can go to Larry. I think that's a tremendous question, Rafael. I think you're right in that I was probably being too charitable in calling what we're seeing right now internationally a lack of coordination. And the way I see it is it's a spectrum, right? It's not an either or, do you either cooperate or compete? It's more of a spectrum of where along do you fall. I think we are certainly seeing an uptick of competition for the reasons that you lined out, but also competition in terms of, are some countries even considering that there might be a way to take advantage of this shock on their adversaries? And that's something that question actually got me into the research line that I'm in now of projecting into the future, great powers taking advantage of climate shocks on other countries to further destabilize them or destabilize the economies of regions that they see as adversarial. And that is something I'm very concerned about going forward, that not only will we not limit the damage, that there might be some countries who see it in their benefit to exacerbate the damage on their adversaries or just people that they're competing with. And so I think this kind of goes into capitalism for sure, but it's also a broader question than that, is really, are we living in this realist dog-eat-dog international world, or are we living in a world where states can overcome those instincts and actually cooperate on issues of mutual interest? So I would say that that's the reason that coordination is so important, because you need that signaling, right? You need the signaling of the United States in this moment saying, no, we are not competing over PPE, or we are not competing right now or taking advantage of the shock. We are kind of putting our own interests aside in the spirit of global coordination. And I'm not purely blaming the United States in this, but I think that it is the state that historically in other situations like the Ebola response and other places has been able to kind of come to the table and signal that coordination and signal that way forward. And if anything, kind of in the climate negotiations, for example, beat other countries over the head and say, I'm doing this, like, can you up your ambition in the same way? And without that player on the stage, no one else has really stepped forward. And if anything, the signaling from the Trump administration in regards to competition has kind of opened up a free-for-all for other countries to do the same. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. It is not the way forward that will be of interest to anybody, let alone the United States itself, because then in those situations, an all-out competition gives nobody what they need. So I'm very concerned, as you kind of put in your last message in the chat, around vaccines for this reason. I think if we're not able to put these competitive early signs aside when and where there's a vaccine, that to me is an extremely distressing situation globally. So hopefully we kind of learn our lessons by that point, or have a shift in political will at that point that makes it unacceptable. And this, just to end, kind of comes back to Giuliano's question, which is how can we as people incentivize that? It's tough. I mean, as you heard from my bio, I've worked in political campaigns. I think the only way you can do that is to change the leadership and to not allow leaders who have acted competitively and outside the interest of the globe to be reelected, because in those situations you are only further solidifying their interpretation of how you should kind of play competitively on the world stage. So it's a limited option, especially if you're not in a democratic country, but you need to elect leaders, and you need to kind of talk across parties that global coordination is not something that's only within one political value system. It's got to be within all political value systems, whether you're conservative or not. And hopefully we can move to that place, though of course I think we've been moving in the other direction in recent years.
Larry and Viola, would you like to add something?
Okay. In the interest of time, I see we have just 7 minutes or so. Let me respond to not Giuliano's question, but the other one about competitive capitalism. We have to remember that there are capitalisms, right? Neoliberalism has been dominant partly because of the the size of the actors that have been pushing that agenda. But there are different kinds of capitalism. And in fact, we've seen, there's a kind of a corporatist capitalism in Germany. There's a more social democratic capitalism in the Nordics. So there are different approaches to, organizing the economic and social welfare. And so we owe it to ourselves to get past the monolithic and look at the specific and try to find evidence for what works, why did it work, what were the strategies, and so on. So there's a bit of a homework for the people and myself listening to this. So there's 2 points I want to make related to that. One is around, I liked the fact that Eduardo mentioned Davos, because I was thinking about how we the people can never get up to the top of the mountain at Davos, but the virus can. And that's a good thing, because that changes narratives around vulnerabilities, right? I mean, as I said earlier, our world is not one world. We are completely disunited. Different realities. We have different vulnerabilities, different values. And so those of us who are most at risk are those who have the least capability of engaging in the discourse that we need to. So I just want to end on the point that, well, how does this happen? Kate talked about critical junctures, right? And in my blog that I wrote for this thing, I talked about it was 1854 when Dickens wrote Hard Times. And between the time that he wrote a book about England that looks a lot like the world that we have today, massive inequalities, environmental degradation, and of course, emergent dramatic interstate competitions and so on. Of course, it's different. I know it's not the same, but there are enough similarities that should inform us that that kind of world built on those kinds of values resulted in the 2 world wars, out of which we had global governance structures that emerged and social welfare systems were built. So between 1854, when Hard Times was written, it was 60 years until the First World War. The neoliberalism came in around 1970s. Today, 2020, that's 50 years. So that's interesting to me. I mean, it's a bit of I'm playing with things, but if it was 60 years between Dickens' Hard Times and the First World War, we've had 50 years of hard times. Are we going to have a war in 60 years? Agenda 2030 should not be about world war. Agenda 2030 should be about sustainability. And so, there are ways of making these points. The internet, Giuliano, is not, it's manipulated by a small group of peoples, but we can use it to mobilize, to organize. And I see no other options other than engagement, dialogue, evidence-based arguments, not just passion and an appeal to values, but we must use and find the allies. I think Eduardo's point about Brazil is not Bolsonaro, right? Find the allies and push and push and push and work at scale, right? Global is also local. So that's my marching orders for everybody, including myself.
Okay, so I'll try to answer both together, Juliano's and Rafael's question. Fair, we live in a global capitalism since the 1990s with 2 major systems, the democratic capitalism and authoritarian capitalism, okay? The authoritarian capitalism has an autocratic system of governance and has a much more state intervention in the economy, okay? And within the democratic capitalism, we have varieties, but with the prevailing of neoliberalism in the last 4 decades, because of the prevail of the American economy, particularly, and also the British. The Germans are really different, and the Nordics are different, okay? So, I don't see any possibility of moving away from capitalism. Capitalism is a very deep-rooted system, even that it has a lot to do, this is a provocation, with human nature, with the dynamic of humanity to individual differentiation, okay? And capitalism has created a lot of prosperity in humanity. The trade-off between the prosperity and the vulnerabilities is still in favor of the benefits. Okay, this is my view. There is no way that there will be a change. But I think there will be, it could be a reform of capitalism to more oriented to less inequality, particularly less inequality within countries, because among countries is much more difficult, and more oriented towards sustainability and rationality, which imply the prevailing of science. Okay, this is it could happen. I am not saying that it's going to happen, but this could happen. There is a significant, there are likelihood of happening. I don't know how much. It's very early to say this. Maybe in 2 or 3 years we will have the possibility of making more predictions about this. And in relation to the possibility of, I think capitalism that is based led by platform corporations is already very well established, okay? And this will continue to expand, but likely there will be more demand for accountability of those large corporations among democratic capitalists. In authoritarian capitalism, it will depend in significant transformation. For example, there are empirical evidence that there was an erosion of the prestige and power of Xi Jinping in China because of the response to the epidemic. Okay, there was this dissemination of the situation of the repression in relation to the medical doctors that denounced the existence of very difficult, very strange illness. And so this is something that could change. I'm not optimistic about this, the possibility of changing the Chinese or the Russian regimes, okay? But I think there is a possibility of increasing account. I'm not saying that the platform capitalism is going to change. It's going to be reformed with more accountability to these large corporations, and this is the way that if this accountability increase, this is the way in which people would be listened in society.
Thank you so much, Professor Viola. We have a last question from Rafael Dubois. We see now countries with difficulties in producing ventilators, medicines, vaccines, and even personal protective equipment. We will watch a reverse mode in global supply chain towards strong policies to foster local industries in order to cope with future pandemics. I will add to that. I think we already kind of addressed this question, but do you think that there's a chance that globalization will be reframed in a very different approach now? We will get more nationalistic industrial policies.
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
sure, go ahead.
Yes, I think in relation to the whole health supply chain, there will be a major change all over the world, in most in countries that have the capacity to do this. So somehow, public health will become part of an expanded concept of national security. Okay, so I think there will be industrial policies in relation to medical, pharmaceutical, and so on supply chains. So more protection and policies, but also could be more protectionist, reindustrialization policies in other areas. Though in the other areas it's more difficult to know, and to know about the profile in which this is going to happen will depend a lot on countries, because how this new protectionism is related to a more equilibrated way of leading between the neoliberal capitalism is based in efficiency. What the pandemic show is that this is very vulnerable. And so we are moving to a capitalism that is more based in resilience and redundancy, okay? That is inefficient, okay? But the pandemic showed very much the question of a very, very weak resilience. So we will have a more equilibrated approach. But also we can have in some countries, and Brazil is one of the possibilities, of moving to very rudimentary protectionist policies that are, it has been terrible for the history of the country.
And I just want to toss in a couple of things here before we wrap up. I think this raises the question about, we've begun to hear these discussions about how we are going to, as Eduardo said, how are we at a national level going to become more resilient through these systems? Yeah. We're beginning to have these discussions around, yes, a bit of import substitution, perhaps. I think we're thinking about that. But, so this is another where we also have to become part of the conversation, because it's about, this is short-termism in reaction to the crisis now. And so the leadership, who, we know they are notoriously short-sighted, election cycles and so on. They want, and people, we live in the present moment. We also want our jobs back and things like that. So there's a danger there of just, as I said earlier, of just trying to restart the same damn machine, or to have fossil-based import substitute, build cars in, build more cars in some place rather than import cars from someplace. That's not what we want. So this is an opportunity, it seems to me, if globalization does lose certain features, right, to have more localized production back in the global north, where they where they outsourced all of that production to the global south. If they bring it back, what will it be? What will come back? What will it be? Can it be green infrastructure? Can it be circular? Can it be, what is it that we're going to want to produce? Is it going to be solar panels and wind turbines? Like what? So I think that we really have to push for a conversation, not just about, becoming more resilient and economically secure, but around the broader questions of climate change, resilience to climate change, resilience to these sorts of things. So we need to have that conversation.
Yeah, just to close up myself, I agree so thoroughly with both of those points. Both, one, that the international global system we've been living in is inefficient, and it's also severely unequal. And the inequalities of that system were laying bare before the current inefficiency question came about. And resilient economies are one that can provide for themselves in shocks. And that is exactly what we're going to need going forward. I think this is the most clear in food systems. And it's actually somewhat exciting to me, while it's made so many farmers' livelihoods increasingly under fire, as well as the larger kind of food system. If we can learn from this moment that the global food system around cash crops and things like that in the global south is also unresilient for those spaces, as unresilient as it is for the global north, that's one of those areas that we can build back better. And we can think more thoroughly about what sustainable food looks like at a local level, at a national level, and at an international level. And that's not, purely just building solar panels and that kind of thing, but it's also rethinking our systems of how rural and urban areas are reliant on each other, and in a closer knit food system, sustainable structure. So hopefully that is one thing that's gotten a shock and gotten a stress test of itself right now, and can be reimagined and reinvigorated going forward. And I think we need that at the industrial level for sure. We need that politically as well. And we need that through all these different systems. But hopefully this has taught us that those systems can be reimagined and must be, if we're going to be sustained going forward.
Thanks a lot, guys, for your answers, for your comments. I would like to thank you very much again for accepting the invitation. I think that it was a great debate, several open points, but also an agenda that we should look forward for us to look forward, and for us to, as Larry said, engage. We have to engage to try to change things. If we only watch the world as it is right now, it's I think much easier to be pessimistic than to be optimistic about it. We live in a very difficult moment with a lack of leadership, with a lot of problems overlapping each other. So not an easy time, but for us analysts, an interesting one. The problem is that just to analyze things may not be enough. So I think that a debate like this one is always an invitation for us to think about how we can engage in this changing process that we all look for. I would also like to think of our audience. I saw a lot of friends connecting, a lot of professors from EHEL, from UNB, Professor Amine Chalal from the Catholic University of Belgium, from Louvain, Belgium, was also here. So I send my regards to him. Thank you so much for attending the conference. It was a great pleasure having the three of you with us this morning, and I hope to see you again in the near future.
Right. Muito obrigado. Isso foi excelente.
Obrigada. Nice to meet you all.
All right. We'll see you all next time, right?
See you.
Okay.
Stay safe, everyone.
Same to you. Bye.
Stay
virus free.
Virus free. That's right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.